Good morning, everybody. Just want to thank you for coming out on this beautiful, beautiful day in Amsterdam. It's like 90 Fahrenheit back where I'm from and humid as heck, so this is a welcome change. So yeah, thanks for coming out. My name is Josh Grunzweig. I'm a malware researcher on the 42 group. Been reversing malware for close to a decade at this point. And I'm here with my co-presenter, Alex.
Yeah, good morning. Good morning, everyone. My name's Alex Hinchliffe, also threat intel analyst at Unit 42 within Palo Alto Networks. I'm one of the regional guys, so I get to hang out in different areas. I'm based out of London and covering the EMEA region. Like Josh, kind of threat hunting, infrastructure mapping, learning about the adversaries and disseminating that information to the public through our blogs and also to groups like you as well. So Unit 42, if you don't know, is the threat intelligence department, the group within Palo Alto Networks. So we have the luxury, I say, of dealing with the threat research side of things. We're doing a lot of work in AutoFocus, our threat intelligence service, and we're basically trying to hunt for new threats, new actors, or trying to understand what existing actors are up to now, what how their TTPs, their techniques, tactics, and procedures are evolving over time, so that we can share that information with you. I call it a luxury because we don't have to do the operational side of the house. And having been in operations myself in the past, I know it's a pretty hairy environment sometimes. So it's nicely ring-fenced for us to look at what's coming in the future. And my parents keep asking me all the time, what do I do for a living, when I try and explain to them repeatedly what I do. So one of the analogies I try and use is we're like data curators. So we take these artifacts in, a bit like a museum would. We try and classify them, try and identify what they are, how they relate to other artifacts, and eventually build out this picture of cyber attacks. So hopefully that gives you some context. And as per the topic of the presentation today, rise of the miners, we're going to be talking a lot about miners, cryptocurrency miners. To specify here, we're not going to talk about any of the JavaScript-based or script-based, browser-based crypto mining. I'm not sure if you saw the talk at 8 a.m. this morning, but we covered a bit about that. But this is all about the binary miners or programs, which are the ones that, the implants, the payloads which are installed on, say, Windows or Linux operating systems. They're processes that run and mine cryptocurrency. We're also not going to talk about the booming coal mining industry in America for anyone in the crowd, but so sorry about that. But we're going to talk about these binary-based malware and some research that's been done by Unit 42 over the year, especially with Josh here, who's the author of much of the research. So very quick, like 101s about cryptocurrency and things like that. It's a distributed digital currency. It's not the first that's been around, but it's things like e-gold and other things have been in existence as well. The difference being with this one, the crypto part of the word. It relies heavily on cryptology and mathematics and things like that to build like this implied trust into the transactions and the verifications which are made. So Bitcoin itself was one of the first. I think it started around 2008, 2009, together with like this introduction of the blockchain as well. And around that time, if you think about it, I think the financial crisis that hit the world, the subprime market in America, banks in the UK, banks in Europe and worldwide really had a bad day at the office, let's say, around 2007, 2008. So as the confidence in like those centralized banking industries and government-led industries was falling, this kind of new age way of paying people and doing things with digital currencies was coming around. So it kind of was a very timely thing. So I talked about Bitcoin. There are about 1,600 coins or so available today. And there are different algorithms for mining them, which we'll talk about. Some of them require specific hardware as well for mining. They can't just use CPUs or GPUs. And some of them even have specific goals. So there's things like IOTA or the Internet of Things related to blockchain and cryptocurrencies as well. So there's some very specific things. When we talk about threats and cybercrime, there's also, I guess, some cryptocurrencies which are more popular for them. They're more anonymous. They may have, a more far-reaching capability for them to make their money. So using CPUs as opposed to specific hardware, and that variation is important to know because you can often predict whether criminals are actually going to try and make their money based on the kind of features you get with a particular cryptocurrency. So how do people actually make the money? Well, it's through mining, and simply put, that is, a computer or a system which is effectively performing hashing, trying to solve a mathematical problem in order to verify some transactions and make that money. It's effectively a race situation, and the winner of the race gets to earn that money. I think if I remember correctly, you can get about 12.5 Bitcoins if you successfully verify a transaction on the Bitcoin, in the Bitcoin cryptocurrency. And that in today's exchange rate gets you like, I think it's like, was it 12?
It's about $8 grand.
About $8 grand, yeah.
US.
Yeah, so it's about $6,500 at the moment for one Bitcoin. Yeah, so it's a fairly lucrative.
Did I say 8? I meant 80.
80.
Not 80. It's 80. My math is not working out this morning.
$6,500, 12.5.
And that happens
Bitcoins.
every 10 minutes or so, just to give you kind of an idea of how much money is at stake.
Yeah, so there's a lot at stake. And effectively, the more hardware you have, the more capabilities to do this brute force kind of hashing, the more likely you are to win, the more profit you're likely to make. Some currencies are pre-mined, some have other rules and restrictions around who can mine them and how. So again, it really depends on those kind of capabilities as to what the criminals are going to get out of that. So if you're a single miner, and probably many years ago you could probably have achieved this with your PC or a couple of PCs at home and have some fun trying to make some money. Nowadays, I think if you're those kind of single users, it's much better to get together in a mining pool situation where you share your resources, kind of like a commune, I guess, where you have multiple people working together. The resources are combined. It effectively, behind the scenes, acts as a single entity for mining purposes. And you're more likely to get some money from that. When the money comes in, it gets split between the people who are doing the mining. Typically, with whoever puts the most effort in from the group gets more of the cut.
Yeah, a good analogy might be the lottery is at some astronomical value. So everybody in the office pools together and say, all right, let's all combine our lottery tickets, and if we win, we'll share the earnings, the profits. People who pay more into the pool, they spend more money buying more lottery tickets, get a bigger cut. It's a pretty one-to-one similar analogy here, where the more effort you put in, the more profits you're getting. And it produces a very consistent stream of revenue. A lot of times these mining pools might contain upwards of almost half the hashing power in the world. So the likelihood of them winning that race is very, very high. So for a criminal, if you're using a mining pool, you're getting a very predictable, steady stream of income. Yeah.
And as I mentioned before, there are some more specific mining requirements for certain cryptocurrencies. So Bitcoin is one where they've had for a while now these application-specific integrated circuits, or ASICs, these specific systems which are built, computers which are built for mining at much higher rates than you're capable of doing with just CPUs or even GPUs. In this case, I think it means that you kind of force the cyber criminals and the adversaries to move away from these kind of cryptocurrencies, because it's just harder for them to get involved unless they're building their own rigs or taking over other people's rigs. So the miners that we see typically running on, say, an endpoint Windows PC or Linux system or Mac or Android are using other cryptocurrencies like Monero that can just run on the CPU and run on different systems.
Yeah, to put in perspective, an ASIC computer usually pushes out as much as like 100 times the hashing power of a traditional computer, a traditional PC. So once these things enter a market for a given cryptocurrency, it just saturates the hashing power. So if you've got a normal laptop, it's darn near pointless, because you're contributing so little to the hashing rates that it would be better used elsewhere. So once an ASIC enters the market for a given cryptocurrency, they entered in Bitcoin's network in about 2013. They've got them for a few others, Dash, Litecoin, so on and so forth. Once that happens, pretty much any criminal activity tends to shift to something else where the infected machines are going to give you a much more bang for your buck, so to speak.
Yeah, definitely. So just to pull this all together, and we've got a lovely animation here. So
I spent
thank you to
an
Josh.
hour putting this together, so I was very sadly proud of it.
Yeah, thank you to Josh and PowerPoint for this wonder. So it kind of covers the three things we talked about. So over there on the left-hand side, you've got Alice with just a ton of compute power. So she's pretty rich. She's got these data centers kicking around. She's winning most of the races, as you can see here, with regards to completing that mathematical problem. In the middle here, you've got an example of a mining pool with all these different users with varying different levels of compute power going through the pool. And as they win, as I said, the funds are distributed. And way over here on the right, you've got Josh with this single PC. But now I know why he got the upgrade from the IT guys. So he's got some more resources there.
So in reality, I would never win this race. I'd be sitting here for like years before I had a chance. But we don't have all day. So, for the sake of argument, I threw myself a bone on this one for one round at least.
You got a small cut. But that's roughly how it works in the mining. So you can see, why it's good to have so much compute power over there on the left. So if we, it's always good occasionally to step back and just reflect on what's going on, as new trends and things happen, like blockchain, cryptocurrency, those kind of things. In this case, we took a step back and we were wondering what was happening with ransomware. So I said we use autofocus a lot. It's a tool that allows us to monitor trends and different things that are happening in the threat landscape, so to speak. And we were noticing, a pretty significant decline in ransomware. We still see lots of commodity ransomware like GanCrab, BitPayment, and a few other things kicking around. They're still part of large phishing campaigns. And I think there's a bit of an uptick in the more targeted ransomware attacks like SamSam or SAMSA going after enterprise networks. Traditional kind of move laterally, find as many hosts as you can, then deploy the ransomware to thousands of hosts and send a big invoice to the customer, or the victim rather, at that point. So yeah, we saw a bit of a decline, wondering what the hell was going on.
Well, at the same time, we saw this cryptocurrency thing just start to really pop up on our radar. So right around late or mid 2017, we just start to notice this strange shift.
Yeah. And I think with autofocus, like I said, we have these tags. So as we started generating more tags for the crypto mining malware, you can see this kind of stuff increasing. So, a few ideas about what was going on. Perhaps users got smarter. They weren't being duped as easily as they had been with phishing emails, clicking on links and all that kind of stuff. But, we still see a lot of that happening, to be honest. So 50-50 on that one. People got better at backing up their computers and having the ability of restoring. And so that if they got infected with ransomware, they were able to recover in some other mechanism. But again, that's a bit tricky. In actual fact, I think most of that is kind of BS. And the real reason is the number of crypto coins that we saw emerging and the value of them was just, rocketing to the moon, if you like. Bitcoin especially was, seriously increasing in value. And I think that made a lot of people sit up, take notice of the cryptocurrency value, and realize that they could earn a lot more money if they were doing other, business operations, if you like, within Bitcoin and cryptocurrency rather than just the traditional ransomware. And I think it's kind of self-fulfilling. So the more people got involved, the price goes up. There's more confidence in the ecosystem that it just spurs more price growth and so on. So if you look at the markets around that time where we saw this coincidental like dip in ransomware, uptick in cryptocurrency mining was, also coinciding with the markets. So Bitcoin went from like $3,000 to nearly $20,000 per Bitcoin between, I think it was like July time and December 18. Some other cryptocurrencies followed suit as well. So Ethereum, couldn't get my word out there. Ethereum had a bit of a boost as well. It went from like $200 to about $1,000.
Yeah.
And even some of the lower value coins like Ripple had a pretty significant boost. They went from 10 cents to about $3, $3.50 or something. So not huge value, but the relative growth followed suit with Bitcoin. So really, it's all about the value there, and the fact that it was more lucrative for people to make money out of it. And on the subject of like the monetization, you can compare a few different breach monetization flow charts or processes, if you like. So the top one here is ransomware, where the actor deploys a piece of malware to the victim. They then encrypt the drive. They ask for some ransom. Typically, especially for like home users, if you think about mum and dad's PC, that kind of stuff, they're not going to have a digital wallet. They need to set one up. They need to populate it with funds. They need to figure out what's going on with all these technologies and pay the ransom. It's also very likely that there's going to be some tech support issues, some just general understanding issues as well, which is why you got that cyclic loop back to the actor. A lot of ransomware offers tech support facilities, phone numbers, websites, FAQs that you can contact to help with your decryption process. So it's a large overhead for the adversary. The middle flowchart here is a traditional kind of data breach where implant deployed on the system, 9 times out of 10 it's not the system that they need. It's going to be some weaker, softer entry point into the network. They're going to have to move around, find out what they need, where the data is they want. Once they find what they want, they've got to exfiltrate that data out, which can also have additional problems. And if they don't already have a buyer lined up, they're going to go to some marketplace, maybe the dark web, to try and find someone who's going to buy the data off them. Maybe deal with some criminals, maybe some mules to actually translate that into real funds and then eventually get the funds out. So pretty long-winded as well. And then finally, the cryptocurrency flowchart is pretty short. It's deploy the malware, run the miner, and start to profit. So as soon as that miner is running, usually as part of a mining pool, it's just going to run at 100% CPU, maybe tailored slightly lower to 20%, but it's still going to be ticking away in the background. It's a lot less invasive than the ransomware stuff, so you're not encrypting the whole drive, stopping someone from working on that computer. For the most part, if it's running at 20% CPU, you might not even notice you have a miner running. So it's very passive, but it generates that money for them.
Well, and it causes much less public outcry as well. You talk law enforcement and who they're going after. These guys are pretty low on the totem pole just because they're not actively disrupting business. Typically, they're not actively destroying data. Sure, they're in the news a lot lately, but at the end of the day, the impact to an individual or an organization is far lower when you compare it to something like ransomware or DDoS extortion or something destructive like the Shamoon attacks over in the Middle East.
Yeah, and I think the process of mining itself is legitimate, right? There's tools on GitHub, there's programs, things out there for people who want to do it as a hobby. So actually some of the software that's running, that's doing the mining, is not necessarily malicious, but the delivery of it, how it got there, those kind of things definitely have a nefarious, bringing with them.
In fact, the mining software itself, you raise a good point, is typically almost always open source. So this isn't even something that the criminals have to develop. They can take something right off of GitHub, compile it. Half the time it's already pre-compiled, so they don't even have to do that. And they're up and running using a publicly available mining pool. There's very little requirements on their end from a infrastructure or setup point of view.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one other thing to mention about this final flowchart is the fact that although the adversary can just deploy the mining software and have it run, they can also attack other things related to any digital wallets you have on that system. So they can put their own wallet in place of yours so that any transactions you make go to them. They can steal credentials you might have for like an online wallet. There's other aspects to it, but it's very easy for them to make their money.
Absolutely. So what we want to do now is really just kind of run through a few use cases for you. Really give you guys a sense of how is this stuff being distributed, how is this stuff being installed on the endpoints, how much complexity is involved in the attacks, and what's the impact, how many people are actually getting infected. So the first use case we want to kind of go over, we've dubbed Pickaxe. It was something that I researched a few months back, and at a high level is actually a fairly straightforward chain of the attack. So it started with malicious advertising, something I'm sure many folks in this room are familiar with. It's a very pervasive problem. Ultimately ends up dropping a self-extracting executable, which in turn just drops some very simplistic VBS scripting files. It actually makes use of a a third-party URL shortening service, which we'll discuss in just a few minutes here. More VBS scripts, and then ultimately it just, again, uses that open source mining software, in this case a tool called XMRig, to do the mining itself. So right from the get-go, malicious advertising, in this particular instance, the criminals made use of a service called AdFly. Now, for those that aren't familiar with AdFly, it is essentially a hybrid of an advertising platform as well as a URL shortening service. So there's kind of two aspects. On one hand, you could be an advertiser, someone that wants to get their content, shown. You want people to see your content. And on the other hand, you're what I'm going to call someone that's tasked with distributing it. Ensuring that people are viewing the content. So if I find myself in a situation where I want to make a few bucks, I think of some link, whether it's a YouTube video or a file people want to download or whatever the case may be. I chuck it into the AdFly service, I get a shortened URL, and every time someone clicks on that link, they're presented with the advertisement. They're ultimately able to get the content that they were expecting. But every time someone views it, I get a little cut, penny or whatever the case may be. So as just a user, I'm essentially able to earn some income. On the other hand, if I am someone that wants my content seen, I can pay, in many cases, very little to have thousands of people view the content. So cheapest in this case is a proxy specific user that I can get 1,000 clicks for 40 cents US. On the high end, if I want United States specific, it's as much as $5 for 1,000 clicks. Netherlands, about $3, kind of split the difference. So for very little upfront cost, I can get a lot of users viewing my advertisement. And I use air quotes because it's never legitimate. It's almost always something malicious. As far as I've seen, it's whether it's a exploit kit or a fake downloader or some adult content, it's never like advertising Twitter or something. It's something almost always malicious. So let's run through a really quick hypothetical. I'm a budding gamer, in my youth, and I decide I really am into Counter-Strike. It's a great game, and I can't afford it though. I can't front the bill. So I'm going through YouTube and I stumble on this video that basically tells me how I can download and install this game for free and play it online for free. So of course I'm intrigued. And as I look in the comments of this video, I see that there's various files that I should be downloading to make this work. So the game itself, a patch, utilities like WinRAR, and they're all AdFly links. So clicking on one, I'm given something that looks very similar to this. Now the top header is not part of the advertisement, that's part of the platform. On the top right, you'll see a skip ad button that appears after about 5 or 10 seconds. But everything under that header is the advertisement. So in this case, it's a fake Flash player download. As I said, it's almost always going to be something malicious. So ultimately, I get compromised, and the self-extracting executable runs, and it drops a script very, very similar to this. It's a very simple script. You'll notice there's very little obfuscation other than them taking this save to file string and kind of breaking it up. And all this is doing, 20 lines of code, is just downloading another file, another VBS script that you'll notice the link to at the top line there. The secondary script is quite simple as well. And it's maybe a bit more complex. It is checking the system architecture. Am I running 32-bit or 64-bit? It has different URLs for either. And it's simply downloading and executing a remote file within PowerShell. Now the files in question are actually hosted on a server they're hosted on GitHub because it's just XMRig, which is not a malicious file in its own right. And they're using Bitly, the Bitly URL shortening service, to ultimately reach them. So this gives the attacker a lot of granularity. If down the road they need to change where that file is pointing to, they can change the URL shortening link to point to the right file. And one other thing I want to kind of call out here, and I apologize because you probably can't see in the back, but the command line that ultimately gets run. So one thing we'll see is kind of in the middle there, C or f.pooling.cf. Now that's going to be the mining pool that this thing is pointing to. We also see max CPU usage of 20. So this particular miner is only going to run with a maximum CPU of 20%, making it, as Alex kind of said earlier, quite a bit more stealthy. You kind of think of this stuff as, oh, it's going to run, my fans are going to whir up, and my computer is going to get bogged down. That's very often not the case because the attackers know this too. They know that if your computer starts freaking out, you're going to take notice. So they oftentimes will go with the sort of slow and steady approach. So as a researcher, whenever you see Bitly or some of these other popular URL shortening services, you should always get excited, because the not so secret with these things is that if you were to take that URL and you add a plus symbol to the end of the URL, the end of the link, you can actually get publicly available telemetry on who clicks it and where they clicked it from. In some cases, you can see what the referrer was, and so on and so forth. So about a third of the samples that we'd uncovered, I believe there was a few hundred in total, made use of Bitly. In total, I believe there was a number of URLs that we ultimately identified, upwards of about 100. And so we took these URLs, we took this telemetry, and we aggregated together to get a full picture of how many people were victims. Now remember, this link is pretty far in the chain, so if somebody's hitting this link, it's almost certain that they're compromised. You might get a few researchers like myself poking around, but for the most part, these are going to be all, consistent victims that have been, fallen prey to this attack. So when it was all said and done, we'd identified 15 million victims that fell, victim to this campaign. And as I said earlier, only about a third of the samples used Bitly. So you could probably extrapolate or infer that the actual victim count was probably close to 30 or 45 million. A very wide-reaching campaign, very low in sophistication. I mean, I'd argue everyone in this room could probably do this easily within like a day. And I mean, I'm not advocating you do it, but it's a very low level of complexity. There's not a lot of technical expertise required to do this. You pay a few bucks for AdFly, you toss some 20, 30 line scripts together. You're making use of publicly available mining pools and repositories like GitHub and URL shortening services like Bitly. There's very little infrastructure you have to maintain, and ultimately it's quite straightforward, quite simple for the attackers.
Yeah, so another example here, that was Pickaxe that we talked about. Just one final point about that 20% CPU stuff. We've also seen crypto mining malware that is aware or detects user interaction with the system. And if it's detecting user interaction through mouse movements, clicks, keyboard clicks and things like that, then it won't operate the miner. But if that user steps away and the system is effectively idle, then it starts the mining operation as well. So again, another kind of slow and steady, more stealthy activity. So this example of Beetor, simply put, it's a Russian torrent site. We translated it here, so it might look a bit strange in terms of the formatting, but it's a torrent site. Started about a year and a half ago, I think it was, and it has about 250,000, or at least at the time had about 250,000 unique torrent files on there. So it's a fairly decent collection of torrent objects. From about September 2017, something curious was happening where if people were downloading links, they actually ended up with some kind of malicious payload as well as the torrent. So in this case, like a World of Warcraft download, the user clicks on the download link here and enters into this malicious chain of events. So the zip file that was downloaded, so it's not actually a torrent file, but a zip file, often aptly named like World of Warcraft.torrent.zip or something to that effect. One of many traditional kind of social engineering lures to make you think that you've got the right thing. You unpack the zip, you get an executable that had the uTorrent icon on it again to give you that warm and fuzzy feeling that everything's okay. And if you execute that, then you're going to start the chain of events. So you get the download, the actual torrent that you wanted, which as like a decoy kind of tactic that you get, something that you expected. And then in the background, you've got a .NET executable, malicious executable, which drops and runs, grabs some data, some payload, some configuration information, and other payloads, but ultimately will run like a 32-bit or a 64-bit process or program on the system, which is going to do the crypto mining. So it's, I think, just an interesting attack vector. It almost goes towards like a supply chain kind of situation where you have an app store or a website that you have some level of trust in. You're downloading this. In this case, you're probably not much trust in this Russian torrent website, but generally speaking, you don't expect to get this kind of payload from there.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately what happened was this guy spent 3-4 months building trust, building a user base, and then just basically, pulled the rug out from under them and started, dropping malware on their systems instead. And timing-wise, it was coinciding right with when we saw that uptick, July 2017, give or take, when he spun up the site originally. So, yeah, presumably he did this from the get-go with this goal in mind.
So another case study, RAROG, some more research that we've published on. In this particular case, there was a piece of malware being sold on like an underground forum, I think another Russian one in this case.
We're not trying to pick on the Russians, I want to point that out.
Yeah,
it just so happens that, unfortunately, a lot of this activity does sometimes, point in that direction.
Yeah. So this user was, trying to sell their own malicious software. In this particular case, they gave us a bit of a head start on the analysis of the malware. And although we wouldn't necessarily trust all of this, we'd like to reverse engineer it and understand more ourselves. Obviously, they're selling it. They need to promote what they're doing and the hard work they've put in. So it's effectively telling you that it will only run once. It will create hidden folders and files on the system, run the malware, delete the original files, cleaning up after itself. It will also modify the registry and do various other things before sending some telemetry over the internet, like the UID, an identifier for the system and the victim machine. And then it gets to the point where it would grab a configuration, download the miner, and deploy it.
It's ultimately just like a poor man's malware analysis report that saved us. I mean, I ended up reversing it anyway, so it didn't matter, but it could save a security defender some time.
Yeah, it's useful to know. So there's also a web portal with this, which is pretty decent. And people get to try this before they buy the service, before they actually spend the money on the tool. So it allows you to look at this. If I zoom in on the top bar, that was probably a bit small for you at the back. There's talk about the previous slide, the forum username. I think it's called arsenku135, about how you can buy that from that person, from that forum. And then there's a shout out to the developer of this code, or at least this panel, called Foxoffski. So you get the names in there, and kind of through a trusted source, given the security of the system was a bit weak, we managed to get hold of some of the C2 information that was present. I think something like half of it, like 60 C2
like
servers from about 100, 120.
Yeah.
Which then allowed us to understand more about the victims, who was either buying the tool and using it, or who was buying it and then disseminating it, where they were disseminating it. So most of the victims, you can see the slightly darker colors, were in Russia. And given this, in this particular case, we're talking about a Russian forum, Russian selling malware and things like that. It's kind of strange to see so many victims there. Typically, the unwritten rule there is that if you're Russian and you're doing, nefarious activities, it's kind of okay as long as you don't target your own citizens. So it's a bit strange to see the telemetry on that one. But that was RAROG.
And it might be worth mentioning just real quick too that the two individuals that Alex mentioned, Arsenku and Foxoffski, have little to no operational security. I mean, if you were to take your phones out and Google their names right now, you'd probably be able to find the real identities in about 30 seconds. I'm not going to display them because that's just not going to do that. But they're very brazen. They're not worried about law enforcement coming after them. And maybe that's just because they're they're kids, they're early 20s. Maybe it's because of where they're based out of. I don't know, but they have no concerns of law enforcement knocking at their doors. So it got to the point where we had continually found ourselves in situations where we're finding this crypto mining software, payload malware at the end of the rainbow, so to speak. And it got to the point where we thought to ourselves, this keeps coming up. Why don't we take a look at just like a high-level 30,000-foot view of what the situation is? We've got a huge repository of data at Palo Networks. Why don't we just try to look at everything and see what we can glean from it? So we ultimately did that. Over the course of a number of weeks, we analyzed and went through a large number of samples, and ultimately came out with about 750,000 instances where we found a malicious miner, where we could also, with a high degree of confidence, ascertain what cryptocurrency it was in fact mining. So this isn't the full data set of all the miners we have, but this is a data set of all the miners where we were able to identify what cryptocurrency was being mined. And right off the bat, you might notice a certain trend. It got quite popular, as we've said, in the past year or so. At its peak, I believe we saw upwards of 15,000 unique malware samples in a single day. So it's been a very pervasive problem in recent months and recent year. So as far as methodology is concerned, we heavily leveraged Wildfire as well as autofocus. So basically, I started with autofocus, started tagging as many samples as I could find to kind of give me a starting foundational point. And from there, I started to pull in all of the reports, the Wildfire reports, seeking out instances where I could find interesting details. So what mining pool is being used, what wallet was being mined to, what email address was being used for the identification when they're communicating with the mining pool, what cryptocurrency is being mined, what hashing algorithm is being used. You get the gist. And what's great is most of this stuff is executed in a new process with certain command line arguments. You can't read that. I apologize. But basically what we're seeing here is an instance where a new executable is being spawned, a series of command line arguments are being passed. In this case, it's pointing to the mining pool. The username is a Monero wallet. It's setting max CPU usage again. This is all artifacts that we ultimately collected and processed.
And that interface, by the way, is autofocus, looking at the dynamic analysis data pulled from Wildfire. So if you're using the tools, you can do a lot of this yourself, looking at the data.
So when it was all said and done, as I said, about 750,000 samples were identified. We'd pulled out about 3,100 emails that were directly tied to malicious mining. So these were the email addresses used when they connected to a mining pool. About 2,700 mining pools in total, and quite a number of wallets as well. Close to 1,000 Bitcoin and about 2,000 Monero. I don't have a slide dedicated to the email addresses, but it might be worth pointing out that I did do like sort of a few days where I just scraped Bing for all these things and just tried to find any information I could as to like who the people behind these attacks were. And more often than not, these weren't terribly wealthy folks. These are folks that were just trying to get by. They were looking for online job postings where they could make a few bucks an hour. They weren't sitting on their yachts. They weren't sitting in their new, Tesla Model X's or whatever it was. In quite many cases, they just appeared to be sort of your average Joe, or if anything, someone that was living sort of below their means. So I just thought that might be worth mentioning. As far as the breakdown, it was by far and large Monero being targeted the most. About 85% of all miners that we identified were going after Monero. And Alex kind of alluded as to why earlier. Monero, from the get-go, was designed with privacy and anonymity in mind. So as an example, if you're looking at the transactions of Monero, they will actually supplement each transaction with a series of decoy or fake ones. So if you're looking at all these transactions, 1 out of every 10 or so is actually going to be legitimate. You also can't take a wallet and just query its balance like you could in Bitcoin. You would need the owner's password or private key to do so. So it really limits your ability to ascertain how much money has been collected and where that money is going as a researcher. But I was determined. I thought 85%, I have to do something with this. I got about 2,000 wallets. What can I do? And then I remember one night I had an epiphany, and I was thinking to myself, well, why don't I just query the mining pools themselves? We'd collected all these mining pool URLs. I knew what the most popular ones, and I also knew that almost in all cases you could query them anonymously. As long as you had the wallet, you could see how much money had been mined and what the current hash rate was. So I essentially took the top 10, and I took my 2,000 wallets that I'd collected, and I just, via Python, just started querying their APIs. And ultimately, I found some interesting stuff. So when it was all said and done, we were able to, for about half the wallets, ascertain how much money had been mined. And in this case, for those wallets themselves, they'd made about 780,000 Monero. To put this in perspective, this equates to about 5% of all Monero in the world. Just for binary miners in our telemetry data set, where we were able to actually identify the mining pool. So it's a pretty large sum. To translate that to US dollars, in hindsight, I probably should translate it into euros. But for US dollars, depending on the current value of Monero, it's roughly about $150 million. At its peak, Monero is at about $400, so this would be as much as 300 million. At its more low point in recent months, it would probably be close to 100. A significant amount of money being made, with the top earners making over $10 million each. Because I was querying the mining pools themselves, I could also query the hash rate, because I was curious how much hashing power these criminals had. And what I found was also somewhat interesting, and it represented about 1% of all hashing power on the internet at the time I queried it. The top hasher in this case actually was about 1/10 of all the data that I looked at. To put it in financial monetary perspective, that top earner is making about $1,300 a day. And when you query these mining pools, they're very nice. They give you a wonderful UI. They let you see historically how much money or how much hashing power is being dedicated towards it. So I took a look. This is actually the top earner from the previous slide. A couple characteristics I might want to point out. For one, you'll notice over time that it starts to decline. So you can infer that people over time are cleaning their systems, they're identifying the malware, AV companies are pushing out new signatures, whatever the case may be. Ultimately, over time, less people are mining for the criminal. You can also see, somewhat obviously, when a new campaign took place. So when he pushed out a new batch of malware and ultimately infected a number of new individuals. One other thing that maybe you're able to see is that on the weekends, it's actually lower. You'll notice this sort of roller coastery wave. And I've talked to security researchers, I've talked to a lot of people, and there's no hard and fast answer as to why we're seeing this pattern. But my personal speculation, my personal guess, is that it's due to the fact that this malware only runs more often than not during inactive hours. So as Alex was saying, when nobody's at the mouse and keyboard, that's when it runs. So at nighttime, it'll run more often than it would during daytime. That also might explain why the weekends we're seeing this drop, because during the weekends, people are at their computers more, and so that's just a guess. But ultimately, we see this pattern time and time again. I've yet to see this pattern used in a benign manner. So if you ever find yourself just researching this stuff and seeing a pattern such as this, you can probably infer that it's malicious. I should also point out that this particular address has, at this time, pulled in about 1,000 Monero. So about about 200,000 US dollars. This next one's a very quick campaign. It was the rig exploit kit. This is just a very quick campaign. Lasted about a week. We see the same pattern, and ultimately it just died one day. It just fell off a cliff. It stopped running. I don't know if that's because the infrastructure died or if the criminal just shut down the campaign. I'm not sure, but all of a sudden it just disappeared, which is kind of interesting. Third example, I just want to point out that it doesn't always look that way. This is the case. A very active malicious miner actually has made about $400,000, and that pattern's non-existent. It looks like any other miner. It would look the same if I were to be doing mining right now. In fact, I used to do mining just as a hobby, and the patterns on the mining pool would look almost identical. I didn't have as much hashing power as this guy. This guy's, but you get the point.
Okay, so wrapping up, we've got a few minutes left just to talk a bit about defense. So this isn't the product track. We're not going to go into details about the products, but I think you've been here for a few days now. You've probably been to the general sessions. You get an idea of what the platform, the security operating platform, can offer. So in terms of cryptocurrency mining, a lot of it is like traditional malware. So a lot of the traditional methods still apply. But for the networks, we have App ID and the ability of identifying certain applications. So in this case, the Stratum network protocol is one of them. And you can look on the Appledia and have a look at some of the other things that we do there.
And that protocol is used for almost every mining pool out there. So whenever you're communicating with a mining pool, it's going to be using Stratum or some variation of it. So that can be very, very helpful if you're trying to identify this activity from a network point of view.
Yeah, that's right. So reliance on security products, we're talking about more of the endpoint products there. So traps for Windows, for Linux, macOS, and Android, the ability to detect these programs which are running and doing the mining. Possibly monitoring the CPU usage through things like Magnifier, looking at user and network behavior analytics to try and understand what things are happening outside of the normal. And then cloud integrity. I don't think we really touched on the cloud stuff, but you've probably heard in the news about AWS instances being taken over, like the Tesla one and a few others being used for crypto mining because there's so much horsepower there available. So things like Aperture and Evident can help a lot with configuration management, understanding about the cloud environment, who's spinning up resources, when and where and why. And also with Aperture, things like protecting API keys being leaked out into things like GitHub, where people can just go and use your resources for free, essentially. So I think that wraps it up. We've got probably a bit of time for any questions. But
pretty sure you've seen this already.
Yeah, pretty sure you've seen that. You can win something. But if you have any questions, otherwise, thanks for your attention.
Yes?
Is there any other methodology apart from dropping a shell kind of thing on the client? Is it possible to run it on a JavaScript based?
Yeah, so at the start, I did caveat that and say we weren't going to talk about it. I mean, to be honest, it's a big area. You could talk about it for days, probably the whole crypto mining space. For JavaScript, it can be embedded into websites, whether legitimately for an advertising revenue instead of using ads, or illegitimately through a kind of watering hole attack or compromised website. Anytime you hit that website, you're going to start mining. You're going to download the JavaScript to your browser. You're going to use your CPU to mine that cryptocurrency.
So our discussion today was primarily around binary-based mining. So it's, they would apply to those. Similar, from the network point of view, would probably be big. From a domain classification point of view, identifying when these sites have been injected with the malicious code that performs these actions. That'd probably be the two that.
Yeah, I was going to say, just to echo that, and when it's running on your local system, it still has to reach out to a domain name. So if it's behind a firewall and you're monitoring those domain names for activity, the CPU monitoring on the endpoint as well, it's still your browser, it's still a CPU, it's still a process on your CPU. No silver bullet, I don't think there ever is. But if you look,
I really wish there was.
Yeah, if you look at the stuff that we offer, it's. Okay. And that's on like a cloud environment, did you say?
And it's on the cloud environment.
Okay. Yeah. So it's
There is no execute rule and nothing.
it's very tricky.
It's very,
Yeah, certainly.
so even if it says that it is going under the radar, for example, utilization 30% utilization, the server infra you will not even notice it.
Yeah, it is very difficult, and I think beyond that, there's been lots of recent IoT device like routers and network devices which have been vulnerable, that have been that have been programmed to inject that code, so that anyone browsing through, like microcheck routers or whatever would get that code. So it's a very tricky place, very tricky.
One more question, yeah.
Sure.
Is it, for example, if in my the computer which I use is infected with the cryptocurrency, with the crypto mining,
Yeah.
is there any legal implication to me if I take it anywhere outside? Is there any legal implication?
You mean if you roam to another country and still continue to mine? Not
I
that
don't
I can
believe
think.
so. I don't
No.
believe, as far as I know, I haven't heard of that ever coming up. No, I think you'd be fine. I'm no
Yeah.
lawyer. Let me caveat that, but
Yeah.
great. Well, thank you guys. I appreciate your time. Hopefully, you have a great rest of your day, rest of the
Yeah.
conference.
Thank you.